Spirituality, trying to look at what we might learn from the Soviet Union. It's remarkable to me how much literature is coming out these days on the Soviet Union and the interaction and so on. There's this week's America magazine, May 19th issue, has an article on Aggiornamento to Perestroika, and it's talking about background of the outreach of the Catholic Church under the popes to the Soviet Union. And it's one of the main points in here is about Gorbachev's own turn to religion. And Gorbachev says he's acknowledged being baptized as a child. His grandmother was, and his mother still is, a devout Orthodox Christian. He has suggested on occasion that it is his wife Raisa who is the atheist in the family. So this has long been rumored and so on about Gorbachev, but raises that whole religion, and it asks the question, well, when did he really come to see this? And it looks through a number of issues and the history to it, but there's no doubt that he has come to think that the religious element is important in the perestroika reform and of making the economy work and the whole political restructuring become more effective. And I guess that's been one of the premises of the discussion as I've been going through it, is that in one way or another we can't understand the interactions apart from the deeper cultural questions. As I've said before, one of the interesting reactions that I had in presenting the cultural material to the Soviet leaders, and I took a very theological stance on that. I was talking to about 220 of the leaders in the Soviet Union, including people from the Supreme Soviet, and very explicitly, directly, and purposefully took a theological slant to that, brought up the importance of the religious questions, and the response to that was really quite remarkable and very open, and they were interested in that side of it, and even as one of the delegates suggested, that that's what they have forgotten in their own efforts to reform and restructure, that is the religious, moral, and ethical side of some of these questions. I become more and more convinced in all of this of the importance of the Russian Orthodox faith as background understanding what's happening, and with Gorbachev himself being baptized as an Orthodox Christian, it might even play that up even more. When we're looking at this dialogue between the Soviet Union and the United States, it's a very hard thing to handle. Very often it's just as when I was talking, there was simultaneous translations and so on, but to catch the nuances of what we feel and think in our country is extremely difficult. And so it becomes important in dialogue to try to, as philosopher Habermas has suggested, that we have to create an ideal communicative network. We have to try to set up an ideal speech situation so that we are able to uncover our presuppositions and we are able to clarify what we are about, that we're able to try to seek a truth that's greater than any one of us has now. I think I said this last week about Senator Dole appearing on television and in a dialogue with the Soviet people and beginning to lecture them a bit or to speak about what they ought to do and have this immediate strong response, don't lecture us. There's quotes from a number of the Soviet officials saying, don't walk around thinking you won the Cold War and now you're going to tell us what to do. They really don't want to hear that, and there needs to be another way to look at dialogue. One of the things that a lot of the people in the so-called Frankfurt School talk about in terms of dialogue is to base what we're talking about on the history of shared suffering. That this becomes one of the ways to enter into dialogue with people, that we begin on a common basis that we've all suffered. For us with the Soviet Union, of course, that has to do with World War II, for example. They lost over 20 million people in that war, and it's very much on their mind. Also, the suffering produced by the Cuban Missile Crisis is often a good one for beginning dialogue. Again, a great psychological suffering that went on, great anxiety connected with all of that. And there's a lot of efforts these days to uncover the meaning of that, and especially the dynamics of how we came to the brink and how we ended up somehow solving the problem. So that is by way of background to say, how we're going to enter into this dialogue. We have to pass over to their viewpoint very often if we're going to get enriched. I did a retreat that some of you were at on Saturday talking about Orthodox spirituality and focusing in on the icons as a basis of that. And in doing so, one detects a certain resistance to passing over in this way because the Russian Orthodox world is so different from our own. Many people, when they hear the thematic content of Russian Orthodox theology, very heavily on the transcendence of God and the cosmic redemption accomplished by Christ, the divinization of the Holy Spirit, great emphasis on Mary and the intercessory power of saints and so on. Many people in our country, when they hear that, say that's the kind of stuff we try to put behind us. Want that, and we've moved beyond that kind of spirituality. The dialogue with the Russian Orthodox seemed to be co-opting us again or drawing us back into a religious world that we enlightened people wanted to move beyond. And so it does become hard, this passing over to another culture, especially one influenced by Russian Orthodoxy, for that reason. It often seems almost like a trap to people that we would move into a world that maybe is that we wanted to leave, and that feels constrictive, and it feels as though it holds us down in one way or another. But I think it really does become important to do this and to try to pass over in such a way that we come back enriched, to set aside our categories, listen to what they have to say, see it from their viewpoint, crawl behind their eyes for a while, and then come back and to see how we might be challenged, enriched, perhaps sometimes even strengthened in our own views. I want to begin by telling a story of what we might call the Soviet Mother Teresa. This is reported recently by Orthodox priests, I think it was, and recalling some of their own history. And I think it is instructive in terms of the topic, which has to do with the attitude towards persons and the question of our individualism and maybe a more communal sense of things that has been developed in the Soviet Union. Well, it is the story of this Mother Teresa. I have trouble pronouncing this woman's name. It's Yelizaveta Fedorovna. I never did master the language, or I didn't even master a few words while I was over there, I must say. I found it extremely difficult to even hear, let alone to begin to communicate. Must say, though, that in our delegation, and maybe I said this again, I'm forgetting what I said in other lectures, but Tom Murray, who organized this thing and put it into some form that I think really helped to make the whole thing work, he began his talk speaking in Russian to the people there, and there was great appreciation. It was like a sign of respect that they felt that they were not being lectured to, but we were really coming on their turf in one way or another. Well, the story of this, I will call her the Grand Princess because that's one of her titles, this woman. See, this is taking us back to the turn of this century now, and this woman came from a good family. Her parents were often gave to charity, and one of the things they did with their children, the Grand Princess included, was to have them go to hospitals on Sundays to visit the sick people there. Well, after a while, this woman married a member of the Russian imperial family, and at that time she adopted the Orthodox faith. And she continued to carry on her life of charity, but after her husband died a tragic death, and she was a rather young widow, she took her fortune and divided up. She gave 1/3 to the state, and 1/3 she gave to charity, and she used part of her money then to create places within first St. Petersburg and then later Moscow where she could help out the orphans and the people who were sick and so on. So eventually in Moscow she set up a dormitory for women, and she had a 22-bed hospital. She brought in some of the city's best medical specialists to help out and so on. She sold medicines cheaply, and she established what we would call a religious order of nuns. And she really got up to almost 100 nuns in this particular community. They served take-home dinners to people, and they tried to educate the illiterate peasants on Sundays. They had classes for the factory workers to come in and try to learn how to read and so on. This woman really did a lot of the own work herself. It does remind you very much of Mother Teresa. She slept about 3 hours a night on a hard bed. She went into the wards and visited the sick herself and so on. And she really had, quite a fine thing going. And she tried to explain this in terms of her own outlook, why she was doing all of this. And she said that, she was doing it because these people had great dignity and worth, and because they had an immortal soul. And they possessed the image of God in them. Something that, as we know from Russian Orthodox, is a key teaching for them. That is, that all human beings are divinized. Made like God, that they have a very positive sense of the human person, something that we'll have to look at more carefully here. But that was her notion, that even if it was distorted in some way by their dissolute life or whatever, that didn't matter, that underneath they had this essential goodness about them. By the year 1914, convent had 97 sisters. Then the war broke out. It caused a lot of trouble. Some of the sisters were sent to the front and were trying to help with the war effort. And then when the revolution occurred in 1917, there were a lot of prisoners released at that time, a lot of them roaming the streets of Moscow. It really wasn't safe. She sort of, as the Mother Superior, by then kept the sisters in. And then, April of 1918, shortly after the revolution, the party decided that they were going to close down this operation. They sent the orphans elsewhere, and eventually they arrested the Grand Princess and transferred her up into the Ural Mountain areas. And in 1918 then, they kept her under house arrest for a while, and then in 1918 she was thrown into this pit in an abandoned mine together with other people, and at that time she was said to have prayed, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Later on, when these people died, of course, they found that she had been nursing the people there, even though she sustained great injuries when she was thrown into the mine as well. Later on, her sisters were exiled, taken out of the convent, and the whole thing was just totally shut down. At some point, in a great act of I don't know what one would call it, but they installed a large statue of Stalin later on, right in this, where she had the church and where she had the altar. It might remind us of when they enthroned the Statue of Reason in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris as part of the Enlightenment project. Well, all of her, through this, she thought of herself as fighting, in a sense, for persons, and fighting against the notion that people were simply cogs in a machine or tools of the state. And as she said, one of her statements, so often, quote from this sister now, "So often do we live for ourselves that we become nearsighted and occupied with our own sorrows, and we ignore the grief of others. We do not understand that to share one's grief is to lessen it, and to share one's joy is to increase it. We must open our souls to the warmth of the divine sun." Well, I use that as an opening to sort of set the stage, I think, for trying to understand something about the dynamics that I think have gone on in the Soviet Union on this question of the person and the individual. And I think it stands as a great reminder of the way that Russian Orthodox Christianity has this deep, abiding respect for persons, and it does have a very theological, religious foundation for it. I want to say more about that as we go along. Well, I see in all of this the great importance of the Russian Orthodox Church. I mean, one cannot understand what is going on in the Soviet Union today apart from that, it seems to me. As you recall, it was in 988 that Prince Vladimir sent out his emissaries to check out the religions in the world, check out Western Christianity, not to impress, Judaism not to impress, Islam didn't make much impact, but when they found Byzantine Christianity, and especially the celebration of the liturgy, they said heaven is present on earth, God is with his people, and they brought that back to Prince Vladimir, and thus to Kiev, which is in the Ukraine, as you know, and that began Christianity in what is currently the Soviet Union. And it really became the cultural glue. It's what held it all together. It was what spread any sort of unifying force throughout. And I think you can look at Russian cultural history in terms of a constant interplay or dialectic between that Eastern-based understanding of human existence, gotten from Constantinople, gotten from the Eastern world, and with its communal sense of life and so on. That, as one strain, sort of the abiding cultural glue, the dynamic, the substance of culture. Remember, Paul Tillich said that religion was the substance of culture. That substance has been formed, it seems to me, throughout by Russian Orthodox Christianity. And on the other hand, you've had constant efforts to introduce other kinds of notions, mostly from the Western world, other understandings of what the person's all about, and then with the Communist Revolution in 1917, you got still another idea that was fighting against what the sisters stood for, in terms of the worth of the individual. So that's sort of the dominant interplay. And of course, when we're doing this, the whole purpose is to begin to think more clearly about our own sense of the individual. And I want to start with the Soviet or the Russian side of this, and look at American individualism, and then try, in the last part, to say how can we learn from them, and what sort of an outlook on the human person can we have today that would indeed help us to function better in our culture. So it really gets back to our American spirituality, and we're using the Soviet Union, the Russian experience, as a sort of foil or something to play off of here. So let's look at this communal aspect here that I think we find in the Orthodox religious tradition and how it got played out. Well, one way of thinking about it is their sense of Christ. For them, Christ is the cosmic Redeemer, but he is totally human, and he is one who identifies completely with us. In Eastern Christianity, very early on, as early as the 9th century, well, even before that, they felt that the Western world was getting off the track on their understanding of Christ. And the major problem was the heresy known as Docetism. Docetism is a heresy that denies Christ's humanity. And it took varying forms, but the Eastern perception was that the Western Christianity, dominated by Rome, was slipping into a heresy gradually through the 4th, 5th century, and they had to call us on that by the 9th century, and saying, well, you Christians are big on the Son, Christ as the Son of God, but you're forgetting his humanity. You're forgetting that he was one of us in all things. And the Eastern people said, we're preserved from that in a sense. Their very artwork, their icons, which are so important. One cannot understand Russian Orthodoxy without the great importance of the icons. The icons, for them, were a way of reminding us of Christ's humanity, and a way of keeping that graphically, artistically in front of them. And the idea was Christ is truly human, And he identifies with us. It's his energy that flows through us. It's his image that we have. That's what gives us our dignity and worth. And therefore, one cannot simply toss away individuals, or, as the Soviets wanted to have it, sacrifice individuals living today for the benefit of the better society tomorrow. With that identification of Christ, it makes little sense. We might be reminded of what Mother Teresa said along this line, which parallels what the Russian Mother Teresa had to say, that, well, if you can recognize Christ in the consecrated bread and wine, you ought to be able to recognize Christ in the faces of the poor people, the oppressed, and those who are hurting. It became her simple theology of why one ought to be involved and why people have this great dignity and worth. So it's one element of the Orthodox theology that helps give us a sense of the dignity and worth of persons. The other way that plays out is in their notion of the Holy Spirit. So for them, grace is not a thing that one has and tries to hold on to or protect, like the ticket to heaven, but grace is the divine self-communication to us. Grace is uncreated. Grace is God giving self to us. So that they were very big on the idea that we are divinized, that we are changed, that we are different people because we are graced by God. It stands in stark contrast again to the Calvinistic outlook on human existence, which is predominated here in the United States, which says that human beings are essentially depraved. That's one of Calvin's lines in his great Institutes, and explains a lot of cultural factors in the United States, like blue laws and laws against gambling, etc., which feel that because human nature is depraved, therefore we must always protect it by building fences around it and laws to keep it in place. Now we want to have a law, too, to protect the flag in the same way. It's like without a law, things will get out of line. So that whole notion yet continues to be part of our culture. Well, for them, it's very different understanding of human nature. We have a divine spark in us. We're connected into the divinity. In fact, their word for it is we're divinized. We're made divine. And a lot of Christians have not been able to deal with that, especially in the West. It sounds like pantheism, or it sounds giving too much credit to human beings and so on. And the Orthodox felt you really couldn't do that, give too much credit. We are supremely important. We had that in the Western Church with Pope Leo I, who said that Christians recognize your dignity. The dignity is based on our grace situation. So that's a second element that gave them a sense of the worth of the person. Now there's another thing that comes in this, their whole idea of the saints and the icons and how they worship. You know, in the Russian Orthodox churches, they're completely filled with icons, the religious paintings. And up front they have the iconostasis, which is a large screen that's protecting the altar in a sense, or screening you as part of the congregation off from the altar. And on those icons, in that iconostasis, very stylized fashion, are painted the patriarchs, the important saints, all the important incidents in the life of Christ, and the local saints that are important in that area or in that church. So that you go into the church and the whole biblical message is there for one. For the illiterate peasants, it was a way of learning the faith. It was all there in pictorial form. So the icons were a marvelous teaching device, and they are also a way of creating a stable religious environment. A whole lot of emphasis in the Orthodoxy, I think I've said this before too, is on memory, not on new thought or creative ideas. Memory, remembering the tradition. In fact, when the icon painters went about their work, they were not supposed to deviate. They would use the patterns of the past. Their creativity came in the use of colors, or maybe the way they painted the eyes in the icon. The master icon painter would do that last, paint the faces, and That would be his sort of distinctive contribution then. But the form, that's why most of the icons look the same. All the virgins are after the Virgin of Vladimir that they came from the 12th century in Constantinople, brought to Russia, and with the Virgin's head inclined, looking down, holding the infant, always the same postures from then on, and the sort of same look in the Virgin. So it's a sense of stability and so on. But the point of this is that when you came into the church, it was as though you were part of the communion of saints. That you weren't worshiping as an individual, but you were worshiping as a member of a community. Very clearly, you were joined with those saints. They were interceding for you. They're all around you on the walls, the pillars, every place. In a sense, you can't get away from it, and you're drawn into that communal sense of what it means to be a person. You're drawn into a whole sense that we are worshiping God as a group and not simply as isolated individuals. And of course, their whole liturgy, long and elaborate, stable in all of its elements, help to perpetuate that idea that I'm a member of a people. We're doing it the same way the ancestors did it before. So that I would propose as a third element that's helped shape the Russian outlook on the person. We see great dignity and worth, and we see a very communal sense of what it's all about. And that brings me to a fourth element in Orthodoxy that has shaped all of this, and that is the idea of the monastic movement. So much of the way the faith was spread throughout the Soviet Union, well, not the Soviet Union, throughout Russia and the surrounding republics, had to do with the monastic movement. It was a very powerful movement, had great figures. My own encounter with that was with the Monastery of the Holy Trinity, was founded by St. Sergius in the 1370s, and which has remained sort of the key monastery throughout the history of the Soviet Union. That's never overtaken. As all the Mongols came in, and the Poles came in, and the Nazis came in, and so on. But this monastery remained independent, remained never taken over, and so on. So it remains as a bastion of Russian Orthodoxy. And the monasteries, of course, created again a communal sense of Christianity. I mean, it was there that you prayed together, celebrated the liturgy together, people worked together, and it created a different sense of life than the individualism that we would know in our own society. Well, those would be some of the background, and I suppose to get a feel for that is to remember how Orthodoxy has continued throughout all of Russian history, right up to our own time, to be extremely influential. There was a time when the Patriarch of Moscow effectively ruled Russia, and had the same title as the Tsar. And there were times when the Orthodox Church, when they were almost trying to set up a theocracy, much as John Calvin would have done in Geneva. And all the way through, even in the 19th century, you see a revival of monasticism and some of the intellectuals coming to make retreats at the monasteries. We see the influence on Dostoevsky and Tolstoy of Russian Orthodoxy right into the 20th century. And of course, my great experience in terms of going to the monastery and seeing the crowds of people, seeing the older people who had kept alive this faith through all 7 decades of persecution and having to go underground and attempts to suppress the monasteries and very few churches left and all of that. They couldn't stamp it out. There at the monastery you saw the pilgrims there to worship God, to go through their rituals, often very much of a folk kind of piety, one that would be very foreign to us, a lot of lighting of candles and kissing of crucifixes and so on, all of that still alive. And so the monastic movement very often provided the spiritual resources that kept people going periodically throughout Russian history. There would be a new impulse given to try to keep the faith alive. So that's a whole lot of, you can't understand, I don't think, what's going on there without seeing orthodoxy and its power, and as I say, it's the substance and dynamism of the whole thing. Let me stop there for a while and see if anybody wants to ask anything about that or comment. We're always open to comments and fill-ins, and yes?
This is a little off the subject, but how about Greek or the country? As far as the rest of the stuff?
No.
Because they
Well, the question is actually about Greek Orthodoxy, and as a matter of fact, just a short summary of that, maybe a review for some people, that from very beginning of the history of Christianity, you've had sort of an Eastern and Western perspective on the whole thing. And you began to get a divergence in the very early centuries between the Eastern outlook and the Western outlook. And then when Constantine established Constantinople as a new center of the empire, the split became even greater. As they had to fight against Islam, became even stronger. And they began to think the West was deviating and so on. That's the fate of Constantinople, and that's where Prince Vladimir sent his emissaries, and that's where they got Christianity. And what they effectively did was buy the whole of Eastern Orthodoxy. They took it lock, stock, and barrel. When they brought it on, they began to build their churches like Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. That's why you see the same style of architecture throughout Russia. They deviated somewhat later on, but those domes and all of that, very much the style. They took over the liturgy just as they found it and so on. Thus, what you have is, in the Orthodox world, are great similarities on fundamentals. You have and especially what's kept the stability was the liturgy. So, and what they used the Church Slavonic, they changed the language when they brought it to Russia, but they kept all the rest of it the same. So there is simple answer therefore is there is great similarities. And all of the same theological themes are there. The majesty and transcendence of God. And yet this divine energy that God has that sort of comes to us and makes a difference. And then the cosmic redemptive character of Christ. He's not so much personal sin, they weren't into that, but Christ has saved the world, redeemed the whole of the cosmos. That's why you see the Pantocrator image is so thing. And that icon sort of says it all. There's Christ in touch, he's in glory and so on, but he's holding the Gospels, and it's open to the passage where all of you who are burdened and heavy laden, come to me and I will refresh you. You get that notion of Christ as the comfort but the ruler of all. So, and then the indwelling of the Spirit, the uncreated grace that I talked about, monastic movement, all that part common in the Orthodox world. Now what happens with Orthodoxy is they're very open to national churches. That's how they function. So in the Soviet Union these days you have a Georgian Orthodox church. Well, Georgia being one of the republics. You have a Ukrainian Orthodox church, Russian Orthodox church. And you have an interplay. I mean, you got an attempt by the Patriarch of Moscow to keep control over all of that. But by and large, they see national churches as being proper and good. And that's what gives it its distinctive flavor.
Have you done any research looking at Eastern Soviet Union on the effect of the Islam in the culture itself? Because it is a very diverse country. And I'm not sure what the demographics are in terms of how many are Christian, how many are other kinds of religions.
The question is asked if I've done any research on the question of Islam in the Soviet Union. As I made my disclaimers at the beginning, I don't want to put myself forward as an expert on the Soviet Union in any way. I spent 6 days there and interacted with mostly economic intellectuals, and there's an awful, so that's background. But my understanding of it is that Islam is powerful, and the story, of course, is in Azerbaijan and that part of the Soviet Union. the Eastern republics, and they've maintained that. I mean, even when this whole official atheism was going on, I mean, you had mosques functioning and Islamic religion being carried on. I mean, they never could control them. And I'm not sure, there was an effort, but I'm not so sure even how much they really ended up trying. It just wasn't possible. And of course, you've got there a lot of this fundamentalist Islamic outlook again. And then you've got the enclaves of the Christians in there, and the fights that go on as a result. So you got religious wars going on there, much as you might have in Ireland, Northern Ireland, or other places throughout the world. And very often the religion, of course, is so rooted in the culture that it becomes all intertwined, and people have great antipathies over a long period of time. I don't know how true this is, but somebody told me that when Stalin, one of his devices was to redraw the boundaries in those republics and to create these little enclaves as a way of keeping everyone off balance and keeping a little bit of strife going on, and so people couldn't be too upset with other things. I really haven't been able to pin that down, but I've been told that that's what Stalin's. I mean, Stalin, of course, the Soviet Union now is, personification of evil. All things bad are because Stalin deviated from Lenin. And of course, what I found in talking to the intelligentsia and some of the intellectuals was that critique now is going to move beyond that, not just to Stalin, but to Lenin. And we're just beginning to see the beginnings of that, and it's very clear to me that we will have a strong critique of Lenin sometime in the future in the Soviet Union. We're already seeing it among some of the intellectuals. So Stalin did all these bad things. But it's a very diverse country religiously. I'm concentrating on Russian Orthodoxy because that's the glue of the culture. That's what gives them a distinctive notion on person and collectivities and communal life. But, I mean, like in the Ukraine, there's 5 million Catholics, uniates that are united with Rome that have been illegal all these decades and are now striving for freedom. That's what that's the interaction between the Pope and Gorbachev is, get freedom for the 5 million Catholic Ukrainians. And that's been the sticking point, hard to do. It's interesting. Throughout the whole history of the Soviet Union, had various religious groups coming in. There was a time when you had a number of Calvinist churches in Moscow. One time there was 3 Lutheran churches in Moscow. Peter the Great brought in a good deal of Protestant influence into St. Petersburg when he built it. You've had pietistic groups. You've had sects that became quite powerful. Fringe kind of groups with strange mystical teachings and fringe Christian groups that have exercised great influence. And I think I said this before too, the Masonic movement. Very powerful and influential. And especially because of its mystical higher stages. So the Soviet Union, I mean, is tremendously diverse. I mean, you can't get over it. It's got 11 time zones. Many different ethnic groupings. It's just, it's an impossible. I mean, we think we got pluralism. And the difference between their pluralism is because the people don't want to be there. A lot of them. I mean, it's not like being in the state of Virginia or something and wanting to have more states' rights, as we've heard a lot in the past about. But I mean, these people got a distinct culture, the nationality, language, and everything. Language is a big problem. You got Russians sort of all over the Soviet Union, and the big thing is they want them to speak the language of the republic in which they're in, and not to speak Russian. So tremendous disputes, pluralism, and religion is a big part of it. How they're going to pull all that together really is hard to imagine. Yeah? The service? Well, I mean, the first thing is that, first of all, I did not attend an official service at the monastery. I was very upset with that, as a matter of fact, that I was not able to do that for a number of reasons. And so, I mean, I didn't have that kind of experience. I've had experiences with the Eastern rites in other settings and so on, and would know something about it from reading. But, I mean, the thing is that the liturgy is very long to begin with, and it involves a whole lot of chanting. They're not big on organ or instrumental music, but voices are important. They have a great sense of the mystery of it all. That's why they have the iconostasis. The idea was that what was going on there at the altar was so holy that you had to sort of shield people from it. It's almost like an Old Testament notion that Moses better cover up his eyes when God passes by, or he's going to surely die. So there's a great sense of mystery and awe. In many of the churches, the way the iconostasis, that big screen, was placed, only the patriarch and the czar could really see in there. So, but what we should point out about all this, from the Catholic perspective, I mean, the Orthodox are full Christians. You know, they have the full 7 sacraments, they have valid orders, they have valid bishops, they have patriarchs, they got the whole thing. And you know, it's another form of liturgical worship. So that would be, so you got the great sense of mystery, and of course the rest of it, I mean, you know, the structure would be the same. You'd have the liturgy of the Word and the liturgy of the Eucharist. That would be a part. Very often the way they receive the Eucharist is in terms of a spoon, that they take the consecrated bread and dip it in the wine and put that on your tongue. That way. They've always been big on maintaining both species. That's one of the things that they didn't like about the Western Church when we were into a period of just receiving the consecrated bread and not sharing in the cup, something that the Protestants called the Catholic community on in the 16th century. A lot of chanting, takes a long time, mysterious sense. One of the other things distinctive about their liturgy is the great importance of the Holy Spirit and what they call the epiclesis, which is the invoking of the Holy Spirit upon the bread and wine. And that is seen by them as a very crucial part of the making present of Christ in the Eucharist. And they would put much more emphasis on the positive initiative of the Holy Spirit than we would. That might give you some feel for what that's about. Let me try to, yeah.
One brief point out the question. If the congregation is shielded by this screen, how can they sit there if they all without doing?
Well, they're not. They're involved in the chant. They hear what's going on. They ring the bells at the important parts so they know what's happening. So, I mean, it's. I think that it is. That's probably a very revealing question. I think that question would come from sort of a Western mentality, obviously. And I think that in their setting it has a different feel. I mean, you're part of the group to begin with. And the whole liturgy is your active praise of God. I mean, I don't think that they would see themselves as caught up in the communion of saints. It's not like, well, I'm this individual and I got to get my prayers in here. It's a whole different sense of what it means to be person, to be human. It means to start out with feeling part of the body, part of the community. And we don't have this distinctive sense of the individual, am I going to be passive or not, and so on. I think it's instructive. I'm not saying that as well as I would like. I think there's a fundamental different beginning point in the mentality of the Eastern world and of the Orthodox world that says, I'm not first an individual and say I'm going to come to the church and like join in and make a community here. It's I'm in the community. I'm part of the community. That's the only way I have my being. And am anything as all as part of a people. And we gather here to worship, and therefore we're doing it together. Whatever else, like we're doing everything else together, like we're clearing the forest or working or making a monastery or whatever else we're doing. It's a communal effort. That starts to become the critique of our Western individualism, it seems to me. It's a totally different starting point. Of course, that's very hard to get a hold of. Our only experience is more in terms of voluntary association, where we feel we're an individual, and then we're going to come together with others to join to do something, like build a library or form an athletic team or come to worship God. And I think they have a different sense of it right away. Right, I've said it before, but I was at an Eastern Rite wedding one time that without a Mass lasted an hour and a half, and I mean everybody sort of was involved. I mean, there's a lot of chanting by the priest and the deacon, and that went on, but then there was usually responsive part, but the mood is different. You're caught up in a swirl of transcendence. They said the onion domes, you see the churches in Russia, and they're not the same exactly as in Constantinople, but they call them the onion domes. And the idea that they sort of have is that the prayer is sort of collected in the community and sort of is rising up together. And that dome sort of represents that. And at the top painted is usually the Pantocrator, Christ the ruler of all, the traditional symbol of Christ. And then that's taken up to God in a way. I think the architecture speaks to that communal sense of things. I want to try to, we're moving someplace here to try to say, we're trying to look at this as maybe a critique of our own individualism, our own outlook on the person. And I want to just go through now some of the things that, the other factors that kept coming into the Russian consciousness that would cut into this communal sense that I think they got from their religious culture. And I suppose the great figure in all of this really would be Peter the Great. Peter the Great wanted to westernize Russia to some degree, and he's the one who built St. Petersburg originally and so on. And in 1700, he told the aristocrats to shave off their beards. In fact, I think as the story goes, he did it himself for a number of them, shaved off their beards. And it was a very symbolic act in terms of this individuality question. It was to move away from the culture as they knew it. And all the icons, the males are painted with beards. Beards are what linked the male of that time to the whole culture that went before. And so it's tremendously, in 1700, Peter the Great says, chop off the beards. The aristocrats had to do that. And, there is one theory, sort of cultural history, that really severed the